This begins a lecture of introduction to the book of Leviticus, a book on the holiness of God. Title, author, and setting of Leviticus. Title of the book, English title Leviticus, relates to the tribe of Levi, chosen to be the priestly tribe, as found in Leviticus 8 through 10. The Hebrew title is from the first word in the book, Vayikra, which means "and he called," referring to how the Lord called Moses and spoke with him from the tent of meeting. This is not a terribly useful title, though it does emphasize that the book has to do with revelation from God to Moses. The setting, they are still at Mount Sinai, continuing the story of the Exodus. In fact, you can argue that the word, if you know Hebrew, the word "va" in Vayikra is the word "and it's continuing the same story that was found in Exodus, and that's perhaps why it begins with an "and." It's not a new book, but a continuation of what's gone before. Author, we've gone over that with the documentary hypothesis, same as Exodus, essentially Moses with some editing. Liberals will date it to after the exile, most of the book being P, well, first part of the book being P, the last part of the book being the Holiness Code, which they call H. We've dealt with that theory under the documentary hypothesis. Outline of the book: first 7 chapters, the sacrificial system. The next chapters, 8 through 10, on the priesthood. Chapters 11 through 15 on the impurity system. Chapter 16 on the Day of Atonement. And chapters 17 through 27, the laws of holiness. A little bit about the sacrificial system. By the way, here's an altar that was found at Beersheba. You can see that it has little extensions on the top. Those are the horns of the altar. It's not a proper Israelite altar because any altar that was made was not to be made of hewn stone, but this was clearly hewn to make it square. Nonetheless, is an ancient Iron Age 700 BC altar. A little bit of general remarks on sacrifice. Sacrifice is giving over things to God. Sacrifices could be of 2 different sorts, either gratitude to God or placating God for sin. Gratitude or atonement are the 2 types of sacrifice. Among the non-atoning sacrifices, for gratitude would be the first fruits, the grain offerings, tithes could be thought of as a sacrifice, and the main animal sacrifice was the fellowship offering, that's how the NIV renders it, or the peace offering, King James, or well-being offerings, all referring to the same thing. Whereas atoning sacrifices included the burnt offering, the sin offering, the guilt offering. Let's go over the non-atoning ones. The non-atoning sacrifices were meant to strengthen and deepen one's relationship with God and basically say thank you to God. They show gratitude to God. First fruits, you would take a token part of your spring crop back to God as a way of saying thank you. Leviticus 2:14. The tithes, described in Leviticus 27. You give 10% of what you produced back to God. The peace or the fellowship offering is the animal sacrifice, which was non-atoning. And one of the major purposes of this one was simply to provide meat for the table. It could be eaten either in the sanctuary as a fellowship meal before the Lord, as it describes in Deuteronomy 12, in Deuteronomy 27, or it could be taken home and eaten there. According to Genesis, it wasn't until Genesis chapter 9 that God gave permission for Israelites to eat meat. And then it gave the stipulation that you could only eat meat if you did not eat the flesh with the blood. Now, it doesn't exactly explain what that means. The meaning of that seems to be implied in 1 Samuel 14. That's where Saul and the Israelites were out at war. The army was famished, and they came upon livestock slaughtered and ate the meat with the blood, it says, in violation of that rule in Genesis 9. And they were condemned, and what they did instead was that they built an altar of stone and had them slaughter and pour out the blood of the animal there. And then they could go and barbecue it and finish eating it. And so from this, I get the idea that perhaps eating the flesh with the blood means eating it without first pouring out the blood before God as a sacrifice. It's kind of like saying thank you to God at a meal, where you are acknowledging that the food that you have comes as a result of God. So before eating meat, Israel was to offer the blood to God as saying, thank you for that permission to eat meat given back in Genesis chapter 9. There were 3 types of fellowship offerings: the free will offering, the vow offering, and the thanksgiving offering. You see on the screen the Hebrew names for those things. Free will offering was you just felt happy and wanted to give thanks to God, so you'd offer a free will offering. A vow offering was brought after a successful completion of a vow, including the Nazirite vow in Numbers chapter 6. And again, it was a way of saying thank you to God for helping you to keep your vow. And then a thanksgiving offering would typically be offered in answer to prayer. God calmed the stormy seas, God gave you safe travel. Well, then you would offer a sacrifice of thanksgiving. Hebrews 13:15 talks about a sacrifice of praise. It spiritualizes it under the New Covenant of simply offering praise to God. But in the Old Testament, a sacrifice of praise was actually an animal sacrifice. Thanksgiving and praise, todah, are the same word in Hebrew. Common to all of these is joy. But then there are the atoning sacrifices, meant to deal with a problem. How can a holy God dwell among a sinful people? 3 types: burnt offering, purification offering, otherwise called the sin offering, and the guilt offering. The burnt offering was distinctive in that the entire animal was burned to ashes on the altar. There was a daily burnt offering, but then you could be offered at will by individuals, a free will burnt offering. In that offering, the animal substitutes for the person. This is probably best illustrated in the story of Abraham and Isaac in Genesis 22, in which God told Abraham to offer his son Isaac as a burnt offering on a mountain that he would show him. But then the ram substitutes for Isaac, showing that the animal is a substitutionary sacrifice. The worshiper identifies himself with this animal by laying his hands on it. And the basic meaning of the burnt offering was entreating God for favor and for appeasement. In the New Testament, the present your bodies as a living sacrifice is probably built on the burnt offering model. Offering the burnt offering was a way of expressing entire allegiance to God and His service. Next sacrifice would be the sin or the purification offering. This was the most important sacrifice for cleansing from impurities in the Old Testament. It was both for sin and for ceremonial uncleanness, which was not necessarily sinful. Certain things made you ceremonially unclean that you had no control over, like a woman having her period. So not all ceremonial uncleanness was sinful, but this purification offering dealt with both sin and uncleannesses of various sorts. It was especially used on the Day of Atonement, described in Leviticus 16. The guilt offering, some people also call it compensation offering or reparation offering, it was of two kinds. It was used when you either desecrated holy things or made a false oath. If you took something, let's say an animal that you had vowed to give to the Lord, and you run it over with your ox so it's no longer fit to give to the Lord, well, you would have to offer a guilt offering for desecrating a holy thing. You'd add 20% as a penalty, and also replace the value of that item that had been desecrated. Or if you ran over somebody else's livestock that had been dedicated to God, you would pay the money to the person, but then you'd offer for the offense against God the sacrifice. Same sort of thing occurred with false oaths. If you swore as the Lord lives that you would do such and such and you violated it, or you give the example in Leviticus 6, 1 through 7, if you committed fraud or theft or failed to turn over property as promised and you swore falsely that you hadn't done anything, then you felt guilty about it. Maybe judgment was coming upon you and you felt the need to repent. Well, then you could restore what you stole to the one deprived of it, add 20% as a penalty to the person, but then make the guilt offering before God. This guilt offering covers unwitting offenses, which doesn't exactly mean unknowing, because some of the sins were sins like theft that you knew that you had done it, but rather they were sins that were not committed with a high hand. Unwitting is the opposite of sinning arrogantly, sinning unrepentantly. And again, the key thing, you added 20% as a penalty to offer restitution to the person you wronged. And all of these sacrifices, as it turns out, foreshadow Christ. Subjectively, they were effective. That is, if you were an Israelite, you experience forgiveness as you honestly and sincerely offered these sacrifices. However, objectively, they were not effective because an animal could never really serve as a substitute for the sinner. Only a human could substitute for a human, and thus they foreshadow Christ, who is the sacrifice that takes away our guilt. He is, according to Hebrews 53:10, the guilt offering as he comes as the suffering servant. He is, as Hebrews 9 puts it, our Day of Atonement, purification, or sin offering that deals with the problem of sin. We will continue this discussion in the next lecture.